Logical and mathematical truths cannot be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and math, so that to try to prove them by science would be arguing in a circle. Metaphysical truths, like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past was not created 5 minutes ago with an appearance of age, are rational beliefs that cannot be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists in the camps did anything evil as opposed to the scientists in Western democracies. Aesthetic judgments, number 4, cannot be accessed by the scientific method because the beautiful, like the good, cannot be scientifically proven. And finally, most remarkably, would be science itself. Science cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is constant in a one-way direction between any 2 points A and B. But that strictly cannot be proven. We simply have to assume that in order to hold to the theory.
In that which matters most to you in your life relies on something other than science. Why do you get up in the morning? Is life worth living? Whom do you choose to love, and why do you believe love matters? Those are not scientific questions, and yet you live your life by those questions. We shouldn't think that if you can't put it in a test tube, or you can't see it in a microscope, or you can't spot it in a telescope, then it doesn't matter and it doesn't exist. We live our lives by intangibles, by poetry, by love, by dreams, by aspiration, and these things are not susceptible to repeat experiments.
When Lewis talks about joy, he talks about something that he labels the central theme of his whole life. But what he means by joy is not the satisfaction of a desire, but a desire that is more desirable than any satisfaction.
There was no doubt joy was a desire. But a desire is turned not to itself, but to an object. I had been wrong in supposing that I desired for joy itself. All the value lay in that of which joy was the desiring, the naked other, unknown, undefined, desired. I did not yet ask, who is desired?
The very experience of joy that Lewis had was an arrow that led to the target of belief in God. Lewis argued innate, deep desires do not exist unless they correspond to something that can satisfy them. If there is hunger, there is food. If there is sexual desire, there is sex. If there is curiosity, there is knowledge. So if there is the desire for this thing that is beyond this world, there must be something beyond this world.
But a new study conducted by NYU may have found some answers. Dr. Sam Parnia is the director of critical care and resuscitation research at NYU Langone School of Medicine, where he ran this study.
No, I'm an intensive care doctor, so my job is to essentially save people's lives and prevent them from dying. But unfortunately, people do die, and we try to revive them. What we have found is that over the last few decades, many millions of people have now come back, and many of them have reported, actually, anecdotally, that they've been able to see and hear things going on, even though from our perspective, they should have been dead and their brain should not be functioning at all. So this particular study is the largest study ever carried out in the world. It was done in 15 medical centers across the US and in Europe. And we studied more than 2,000 people who'd gone through this cardiac arrest or process of death. And we did not expect people to have any consciousness or awareness. But intriguingly, up to 40% of people came back and had a perception of being aware of what was happening to them, even though they had technically gone beyond the threshold of death.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lot to it. I should also add that among that group, 10% had a very deep, profound mystical experience that was very true to them. But interestingly, 2% actually had full awareness, could describe all the events that were going on that were validated. So of course the question is, why does that happen? And we don't have the answers, because to our scientific model, when people have died, there should be no more conscious awareness going on. But it sounds like maybe consciousness is able to continue. And by that, I don't mean that they're awake, but that entity that makes us who we are, makes Sam who he is, makes Rena who she is, the self, the mind, seems to continue and doesn't become annihilated after a person has gone through their process of death.
Do you have some sort of conclusion as to how far the mind and consciousness goes?
Again, from what we can determine, which is actually fascinating, and it raises questions about our whole science, about what happens when we die, is that it appears that even though people have gone beyond that threshold of death and their brain has shut down, that entity that we call consciousness, the mind, the psyche, whatever you want to call it, does not seem to become annihilated. From the evidence we have, that at least tens of minutes, if not hours of time afterwards, how long beyond that, we don't know at this point.
For the folks who have lost consciousness and come back, have there been any long-term effects afterwards?
Well, those people who have these very deep, profound, mystical experiences, often they describe a sensation of being very peaceful, seeing a bright, warm, welcoming light, sometimes deceased relatives. And intriguingly, some of them describe a sensation of a being that they describe as being perfect and full of light and love and compassion. Those who have that experience are often very positively transformed for the rest of their lives. It's very profound, it's real to them. They become less afraid of death, they lose their fear of death completely. They engage in altruism, they're more helpful to people, they engage more with family. It completely changes them. So there's something very profound about this experience that they have.
In a case for the resurrection. Well, virtually all skeptics, makes no difference if you're a believer or an unbeliever, they put 1 Corinthians, a book that Tim accepts and says is reliable. They put Paul's Creed, this early statement that Tim summarizes on page 427. Paul says, I gave you, listeners from Corinth, I gave you the text, the story of the gospel, which I received. Now, he's writing this in 55 A.D.
And the crucifixion was when?
The crucifixion, give or take a year or two, is about 30 A.D. That's a nice round year. Critics are willing to say that Paul probably got this material about 35 A.D., but Peter and John and James had it before Paul did, and so we're right on top of the event. This material goes back to 30 A.D., and from this, we get a very early account, 30-ish, right on top of the events. We get eyewitnesses. Paul at least is an eyewitness. Then we get Paul, the eyewitness, telling us that James, Peter, and John agree. And then thirdly, we have what I might call, if I want to keep up with the E's here, enthusiasm. Their lives are transformed by their belief that they saw the risen Jesus. People get transformed for a lot of things, but these guys claim they saw the risen Jesus. And fourthly, a fourth E, I believe that Paul implies an empty tomb in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following. So we have early eyewitnesses who are enthusiastic and willing to die for their message that Jesus appeared to them with an empty tomb.
Okay. Tim, there is a minimalistic case, but a case being made for the resurrection. How do you respond?
Well, you've mentioned the life-transforming aspect. There are people who've had their lives transformed by converting to Islam. I don't think Dr. Habermas would say that proves that Islam is divinely inspired.
I totally agree with him that anything can cause a life change, usually a religious or political commitment, but anything can cause a transformation. That wasn't my point. My point was that the disciples just weren't changed. They were changed because they believed they saw the risen Jesus. Now, transformations cannot prove what somebody's saying, but transformation can prove that somebody believes what they're teaching. And if we have the earliest apostles teaching that they saw the risen Jesus, we can say they're wrong, but we have their sincere belief that they believe in the risen Jesus, so sincere they're willing to die. I think that's very valuable. When a Muslim dies because he believes in Islam, that's his belief centuries later that Islam is true. But if you go back to the original disciples, they died because they believed they saw the risen Jesus.
Start out with Mark's resurrection appearances. Well, there aren't any, basically. The women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome go to the tomb. They find it empty. A young man in white sitting inside, presumably an angel, says Jesus is risen, and he'll meet the apostles in Galilee and go tell them. The women are terrified, and they don't tell anybody. And that's the end of the account.
There's a supposition here that I want to mention. The idea is that the Gospel of Mark is the earliest, and since there are no appearances, we're in trouble. Tim's not necessarily saying that, but others have said that. First of all, I want to say Mark does have an appearance, maybe more. He says, go tell the disciples and Peter. Some scholars think that that's an intimation of the appearance to Peter earlier, but be that as it may, Mark specifically says he's been raised. But the additional point I'd like to make here, and then I'll see what he says, is his point that Paul predates Mark by 15 or 20 years. And Paul has the longest list of appearances.
Except that Paul just basically gives kind of a summary. He doesn't give a blow-by-blow appearances.
First of all, Tim, if Paul has a summary here, as you said all we have is a summary in Paul. I want to know what's wrong with the summary. He gives a long list of appearances. If he gives more appearances than any other disciple, I want to know what's wrong with the good list from right on top of the events. If he received this material in 35 AD, if two of the disciples, well, I'm using the dating of the critics. I'll give you a list of them, but these are people who are atheists and people who do not agree with evangelicals, and they put it in the 30s AD. So if Paul only, quote, has a summary, I'll take that summary, because we can make a case based on that summary alone. It's excellent evidence.
You know, we're running a bit out of time here.